Reading 42 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll. Volume 2. Birdlip, October 21st, 1944. Self-Observation and Self-Remembering, Part 2. In this second paper, we come to answering the question that was quoted in the last paper. I will repeat the first part of the question. Quote, as I understand it, there is a difference in quality between the state of remembering and an act of self-remembering, and many degrees of or levels of quality between acts of self-remembering. Yet the least of these is greater than, on a level above, the fullest self-observation. End quote. The act of self-remembering is a conscious effort made in order to remember oneself. The state of self-remembering is the result of the act, and the quality of the state of self-remembering depends on the quality of the act, the quality of the effort made to remember oneself. Let us try to illustrate this in an easy way. The act of taking my guitar and striking notes on it is different from the state of being able to play music on it. However, I will have to make an effort to take the guitar and play on it before I can reach the state of being able to play music. Again, if I want to behave better or have better manners, the act of trying to is not the same as being in the state of having better behavior or manners. If I make right effort, I may reach the state that I wish to attain, and the result will be according to the quality of my effort. The act of trying to remember myself is to endeavor by trial and failure to reach some new state of oneself called the state of self-remembering. If already I know how to reach this state, then the act or effort that I make will put me into this state. But I cannot expect at first by performing the act of self-remembering to reach the state. It will only be by long work, by innumerable acts, that I gain any success in reaching the state that I aim at reaching. Now, let us take the second parts of the question in which it is said, quote, there can be no progress unless and until a man remembers himself. End quote. I think that it would be best to say here that unless a man can lift himself up by self-remembering, he does not receive help, and that unless a man receives help, he cannot reach a different level of being. But at the same time, unless he prepares himself by means of self-observation and trying to separate from what the work teaches our wrong functions, he cannot receive the influences coming from higher centers. Man has to prepare his lower centers so that they can hear the voices of higher centers, which are always speaking to us and always trying to change us, but which we cannot hear. I do not mean that the higher centers are trying to change us exactly, because they are neutral, not violent or accusatory. You feel the absence of higher centers in the general feeling of uncomfortableness, as if you had forgotten something you once knew. Unless lower centers can begin to hear higher centers, there is no possibility of getting help for evolution. Remember, man is created a self-developing organism, but he must receive help from esoteric teaching in order to evolve. He is disconnected from real I, which belongs to higher centers and can transmit their meaning. Real I understands the language of higher centers, but false I does not. Real I is what you are and why you exist, or rather, why you exist is to come into contact with real I. In one of the esoteric writings of India, it is said, if a man fails to reach God, he is continually reborn into existence. and so he goes round and round in the whole cycle of possible births until he understands why he exists." End quote. Since everyone has real I in them, but at a higher, that is, a deeper level than that from which they ordinarily live and think and feel, everyone is created with the possibility of making contact with this real I, of which they are nothing but a foolish reflection or imitation. Everyone has an eternal center of gravity, but being swayed by the senses, by the feeling that they are nothing but their bodies, and by the impact of impressions coming from external life, they get far away from this center of gravity. Self-remembering is the beginning of the attempt to bring us back into ourselves, and so into our real center of gravity. That is why a very external person, who is simply governed by the effect he or she makes on other people, has a very great difficulty in understanding what self-remembering means, and indeed what this work means. On one occasion, G said, "Behind real I lies God." But the beginning of all this, way back to our real origins, starts with observing I. This means, of course, that it starts with the work itself, for observing I must know about what to observe, and do it from what the work teaches. If you have a wrong mirror, a wrong observing I, some social I, it is not in the work sense observing I. But if you can establish in yourself a point of observation from what you can understand of what the work teaches you to observe, you are on the first rung of the ladder that reaches ultimately to real I. People think it is easy to establish observing I in this real work sense. I would say it is a very difficult matter and requires a long struggle, a great deal of inner sincerity, and a great deal of failure. When this observing I is established, it collects other eyes round it that wish to work, that wish to understand better, that wish to find the secret of one's existence. Everyone really has this secret feeling about themselves, but they do not put it into operation. They do not know what to do, and so it simply becomes a source of negative emotion. When deputy steward is formed, it may attract steward and finally real I. But these are words of very great density of meaning. To understand anything of this ladder of the work takes a very long time and very deep reflection. For example, it means a great deal of thinking what the work is about, and rethinking about it, and seeing the state of one's being, and re-seeing it. It requires a great deal of inner realization. It requires continual access of valuation, continual renewing of valuation, a continual re-understanding of what one understands, a seeing of where one is and what one is. And in this connection, I might say that all of you who are following the path of the work and have long ago understood that it is not something on the blackboard, will find that even the simplest sayings of the work transform themselves into deeper and deeper meanings. You will find, in short, that this work and all its brief formulations could only come from a source that knows and understands far more than we do. Quote, "Yet the least of these acts of self-remembering is greater than, on a level above, the fullest self-observation." End quote. I find some difficulty in answering it. It means, to begin with, that an act of self-remembering is greater than an act of self-observation. I would say to begin with that speaking of fullest self-observation is beside the point. Full self-observation could only come with an enormous increase of consciousness, and in that sense would be the same as that increased consciousness of the state of self-remembering, self-awareness, self-consciousness. To be fully aware of oneself would correspond to the third state of consciousness. An act of self-remembering for us as we are is a very weak thing. An act of self-observation may be more distinct. The two are not on the same level, but a state of full self-observation would belong to the level above us. But how could we at our level of consciousness expect to observe everything fully in ourselves? How could we, for example, fully observe the whole of our lives altogether? Or indeed, how could we observe at our level of consciousness all that is going on in every part of a center? You know there are many stories of people who, when partially drowned, remember the whole of their lives. I think these stories are probably quite true. I believe that at the point of death, a man may pass into a different state of consciousness. In the terms of this work, we would call this the third state of consciousness, the state of self-remembering, self-consciousness, or self-awareness. Then, no doubt, a man would have full observation of himself. Yes, and full observation of himself in a way he never dreamed of. But as we are, self-observation is a very small thing, but quite essential, like carrying a tiny light through a big, dark house and seeing one thing after another. After a time, memory, that is, work memory, or memory created through conscious effort in self-observation, may connect together all these separate small illuminations into something bigger. This means that a man begins to take photographs of himself. That is, he begins to observe himself over a period of time altogether. From this moment, he can begin to catch a glimpse of his chief feature. He can begin to see strands running through his life. He begins to see patterns in the carpet of his life. You notice that in the three definitions of the third state of consciousness, the term self-awareness connects with full self-observation. I find this part of the question difficult to answer because it assumes that full observation is a possibility at our level of consciousness. If a man at his present level of consciousness had a moment of full observation, he would probably go mad, because it would mean that he saw all the inner contradictions in himself. To reach such an insight requires long work, and the work will never allow a person to see more than he can stand. I think we all make a mistake in thinking we can attain a higher degree of consciousness just in a moment. Consider how long it took you to learn to read or write. One hears the work for a long time, just as a child sees his letters for a long time, but it takes many years before it can speak or write. A curious thing here, if I may add, is that suddenly a child finds it can read, and just in the same way, in the work suddenly, you find you understand something you have heard time after time. This means you are ready for it. You have earned it. Now, to take the last part of the question, quote, all work on himself below that level is preparatory to progress towards consciousness. Further, a man can protect himself psychologically only by self-remembering, end quote. I have no comment to make on this part of the question, but it requires to be understood. The phrasing is right. To be protected psychologically from the external scene of life, one must remember oneself. This means that one must find something to take the place of identifying with all that goes on in life. If you take life as the whole business and think you are nothing but your body, you will not be able to remember yourself. If you think your eyes see, and not that something sees through them, you will not be able to remember yourself. If you think that everything you do and feel and think belongs to your body, you will not be able to remember yourself. You will then be like religious people who think that heaven is something above and hell something below them, and do not understand that heaven and hell are in them, in themselves. You take as reality the messages coming from the external senses, and no doubt you will think that real I is something that exists far away in the visible stars. You will not understand that it exists in you at a deeper level of your understanding, and that you can only reach it by understanding all that this work says about separating yourself from wrong activities going on mechanically every day that keep you glued to the most external, most superficial side of yourself, that side that is governed by everything that happens to you outside, that side that depends for its well-being on how people behave towards you. And this is inevitable as long as you have no inner behavior that you are following. The work is about this inner behavior, which gives you a center of gravity independent of external things. But I repeat, if you think you are the same as your body, and that your eyes see and your ears hear, and if you have no sense that it is you who sees through your eyes, and you who hears through your ears, and that there is something different in you from your physical senses, and in fact something higher, then you will not be able to remember yourself. If you are a natural man, a man who believes only in the reality that the senses show him, who believes that the natural world, with all its events, is the cause of everything, you will never be able to remember yourself, nor will you be able to understand the ray of creation, nor the side octave from the sun. You will never be able to understand that influences are acting on this earth, coming from a higher level, and acting on you, yourself as well, and that you receive these influences according to the quality of your being.